Okay. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Better Utah Broadcast. It is Wednesday, 12:30. We're going to be doing these every Wednesday at 12:30. Every week, we're going to have guests on from various organizations, various legislators, people in Utah who are making a difference and getting involved. And with the legislative session coming up on Monday, please be sure to watch here for updates about our legislative priorities and what exactly is going on during the session. And make sure that you click reminder. You can't see it now, but when you see our little image pop up that we're going to be doing a live, you can click on there, get reminder, so that you can get a reminder about when we're going live. So today we have Noah Rosenberg Hi, thank you for being here. From Better Boundaries. So we're going to kind of jump right in. Better Boundaries is seeking to address, it's a ballot initiative seeking to address gerrymandering. So gerrymandering is a pretty hot word that we have going around nationally.
Definitely.
Yeah. So just let's get started with exactly defining what gerrymandering is.
So gerrymandering is any time a district for a political office is drawn in order to advantage one political party over others or to advantage a particular candidate over others.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so that kind of happens. Can you tell us what packing and cracking is, how they do that?
So packing and cracking are good examples of what's called partisan gerrymandering. So that's when you want a particular party to win or lose. So packing is where you would include specific groups of voters into a district in order to ensure that that district would go either for your party or for your opponent's party. Mm-hmm. Cracking is when you split, it's typically your opponent voters up into multiple different districts so that you can ensure that they will not have the majority in any of those districts.
Okay, cool. Well, I mean, not cool, but good information. Okay, so now let's talk about the national climate. So like I said, it's a very hot word all over the country. In particular, North Carolina just had something happen with redistricting, and then we've also got something in Wisconsin. So can you give us kind of a background on North Carolina?
Yeah, so North Carolina most recent redistricting plan was struck down by the courts, and it was struck down because it had been drawn in a way that took into account party affiliation of the voters, which the court said was inappropriate.
And that's kind of monumental, right? Taking into account affiliation.
Up to this point, no lower court has ever issued a ruling like this on partisan gerrymandering.
Okay. So when you say partisan, Democrat, Republican.
Right, Democrat, Republican.
So up until this point, it's been about a specific demographic, right?
Right. So there are federal laws. So like the Rights Act, which requires that states, when they do redistricting, they create districts that include a majority of what might be a minority voter population for the whole state, but they make up a significant chunk of the population of the state. So the Voting Rights Act would require that a state draw a district where those folks will be the majority so that their voice can be represented in the system at the federal level in particular.
Okay, great. Chase says we have a question.
Yeah, Gerald Adam Davis is asking, what are your thoughts on multi-member districts?
Multi-member districting is really, really interesting. Our ballot initiative doesn't address that specifically, but I think there's a lot of movement. For people at home who maybe don't know, multi-member districts would be where you would have an election for a particular region or district, and the outcome of that election would determine usually it's three representatives from that district. So instead of saying the person who gains 50% plus one voters in this district, they get the seat, it would instead say, well, the party or group that got 30%, they will get one of the seats, and the party or group that got 2/3 of the vote, they will get two of the seats.
Oh, wow. So it's by party.
Yeah.
Okay, that's very interesting.
So it's a little bit more similar to like a European parliamentary style election. No states currently do this as far as I'm aware. But I think there's definitely movement in that direction, and I'd be interested to see how that's going to shake out over the next few years.
So does that work also? So that, I would assume that would just be for federal seats. That wouldn't work for
So it could work for local seats. So in the case of Utah, I can't exactly speak for other states just because I'm not that familiar with their state constitutions.
Sure.
But in Utah, we would have to amend the state constitution because that's where it lays out how many members serve in each in the House and the state House and the state Senate. And an amendment to the Utah Constitution is even more complex than a ballot initiative. So you have to gather a certain number of signatures, and then it has to be approved by voters, and then 2/3 of the legislature has to vote in support of it. So typically constitutional amendments only happen if the legislature thinks they're a good idea.
Yeah, okay, so probably not anytime soon. So let's go back to national climate. So we've got North Carolina, and then what's going on with Wisconsin?
So Wisconsin, you've got the GAVI Whitford case, which I'm sure a lot of our viewers have heard about before. So that's a Supreme Court case that relates to redistricting that happened in Wisconsin. And the Supreme Court in the past has said, the conservative wing of the court has said we don't believe it's the role of the court to rule on partisan gerrymandering. The liberal wing of the court has said we do believe it's the role of the court to rule on partisan gerrymandering. And then the swing vote, Anthony Kennedy, has said in the past on cases, I think it is the role of the court to decide these cases, but I don't have a good social science measure to tell me whether a district is gerrymandered or not. So what this case is really about is trying to get the Supreme Court to adopt a particular measure, which in this case they're calling the efficiency gap measurement, to allow lower courts to use that as a test for determining whether districts are partisan gerrymandered or not.
And the efficiency gap takes, I mean, it's just a mathematical formula basically, right?
Yeah, so it's a statistical measurement. So what they're doing is they are evaluating wasted votes. So for the efficiency gap, what they're calling wasted votes are any vote that went to the winner in an election that the winner didn't absolutely need to win that race. So any vote over 50% plus one, and then any votes that went towards the loser of the race. And then they are using that to decide whether or not, essentially across a whole state, how many seats should have gone what way, given the total population of people who voted in, let's say, all of the elections for State House of Representatives in a given place.
So it's like, it's basically saying how competitive a district is, right?
Right.
And the idea behind it is that having a competitive district is good.
Yes. It's also a reliable measurement of practices like packing and cracking.
Okay. Interesting. So now here's a question that you get asked all the time, I'm sure.
Okay.
Why should a Republican in Utah care about gerrymandering in Utah?
So I get this question all the time. People often will say, isn't this issue just for Democrats, right? Aren't you just trying to get Democrats to win? And my response has a couple of parts. The first part is Better Boundaries is a nonpartisan ballot initiative. And we actually have campaign chairs. We have 4 campaign chairs. 2 are Republicans and 2 are Democrats.
Okay.
But my second follow-up answer would be that this initiative isn't just about fixing partisan gerrymandering. It's also about fixing gerrymandering that has to do with which candidate wins or loses. So candidates will frequently, they are currently allowed in Utah to draw out the homes of their political opponents, so people who've run against them in the past. And that's not just from the opposing party, that's also from their own party. So they can draw their districts in a way to avoid primary challenges, not just general election challenges. So Better Boundaries is actually about making that system more equitable so that candidates can't engage in that. But it's also about making sure that the voices of the really very different communities and diverse communities that Utah has are represented when we're talking about issues at a state level. A great example of an area where these voices have been really diluted and mixed together in a way that's harmful is in Summit County, in Park City. So Park City is in the same state Senate district as almost all of the northeastern section of the state. So those are towns like Heber, which is a slightly bigger city, but it's also small towns like Altamont. Once you're east of Park City, the majority of people are working in industries like cattle ranching and oil mining, whereas the people who live in Park City are engaged in completely different work. So the challenge with a district like that is you are setting a district up, you're setting the representative of that district up to fail. At some point, they're going to have to make, do I represent the needs of the more urban part of my district in Park City? People who might work in finance, or they might work in tech, or they might work in a small business, a mom and pop store. Or do I represent the part of my district that is cattle ranchers and oil drillers, right? Both of those sets of voters, both of those sets of communities deserve to have their voice heard in a discussion on any part of state policy. But that representative at some point will be faced with a time where they can't represent both of the voices at once. They have to take a yes or no vote. And the yes vote would represent one community and the no vote would represent another. And that's not fair to those communities, that one of them has to be sacrificed by virtue of the way the districts were drawn. And it's not fair to that representative that they can't fully represent their entire district.
Sure, yeah. So let's talk a little bit about the history of gerrymandering in Utah and how it has an impact on our elections.
Sure.
So when does redistricting happen? Why does it happen? And how did it happen specifically in Utah the most recent time?
So redistricting happens for one of a couple of reasons. The most common reason is because of the census. So every 10 years after the census, we redraw all of the boundaries for all of our offices because the goal is to have roughly the same number of people living in each of the districts. It never quite works out to be exactly the same, but it's pretty close. So for instance, in Utah, a state house seat will have around 35,000 people in it, no matter which state house seat you're looking at. Some of them will be geographically bigger and geographically smaller, but they'll all have the same number of people. Another time where you would have redistricting is if Congress decides they're going to give the state an additional congressional seat. So that most recently happened after the last census. We gained a 4th congressional seat.
In 2010.
And so part of that was because the population of Utah had increased so much that Congress wanted to give us a little bit more representation. Because unlike at the state level, at the federal level, each congressional seat does not have the same number of people in it. Their goal is to keep it as close as possible, but it never quite works out. Wyoming will always have 1 congressional seat. California will always have like
a million.
So that's the second reason redistricting can happen. The third reason redistricting can happen is if previous district boundaries are struck down by a court. So North Carolina is a good example of that, right? Their districts were struck down. The court said these are not acceptable, and the result is that the legislature has to go back and draw those boundaries again.
But the last election, do they have to redo elections?
So no, they don't redo an election.
So once you're in,
you're in.
Wow.
I have never been part of that kind of a process, but I would imagine it's pretty interesting in terms of, because so I can say the last time Utah did redistricting, one thing that happened pretty frequently was 2 currently serving members of the state legislature would end up being put into the same district, which means that only one of them, right? The districts, who can run for a district is determined based on who lives in the district. But
not congressional seats.
Not congressional seats. Congressional seats aren't like that. But for the state legislature, you have to live inside the district in order to run for it. And so by having two members of the same body end up in the same district, that meant one of them would not continue serving. So that usually ends up getting worked out in an election. They would probably run against each other in a primary, or one of them would step down. But that can be a pretty powerful tool when you are looking to handicap a political opponent. If you force them, if you put their house in a far more competitive district where you don't think it's likely they will win, that is definitely a tool that is used in drawing district lines.
Oh, man. I had a clever thought and it just went away. So let's talk about, here it is. So Utah, you talked about, we just got a 4th district, right? In 2011, because it was the 2010 census, right? So, and that was, at that point, Matheson came over from, was he in the 2nd district?
So my recollection may be wrong, and you should correct us in the comments if you know.
Just threw you under the bus on that one, sorry.
But I believe Matheson was the 3rd district.
Yeah, that actually brings it
and then runs for the first time in the 4th district in 2012 and takes that seat in 2013.
Yeah, that's my recollection too, yeah. So we just got that seat, but Utah is going to be growing, according to the Kempsey Gardner Institute of Politics, at the U, we're going to be growing by a Taylorsville-sized population every year for the next 50 years.
Right.
So we're probably going to get a couple more congressional seats, probably.
It's possible. It all depends on. It's for those federal seats. It's not just about how much Utah grows. It's about how much other states grow or shrink. So if the whole country grows at the same rate as us, which is pretty unlikely,
we're growing very fast.
Would stay the same. If other states shrink, they would lose a seat, in which case then that seat has to get given to someone.
Right.
But that decision is made by Congress itself. So they decide who gets which representatives. And so some of it is driven by population, but some of it is also driven by, there was a dialogue in this would have been the late 90s, about giving a congressional representative to the District of Columbia. And in exchange for that, they were talking about giving Utah an extra seat at that point. So there's also political trade-offs like that as well can happen.
Okay, cool. Kind of a little bit of a detour of the conversation, but are there concerns in the gerrymandering world or just redistricting world in general about the validity of the census information that's going to be coming up this year, in 2020?
So there have been concerns raised. One major concern that was raised was that the president had asked that citizenship status be a question in the next census. And many experts had raised the possibility that would decrease the likelihood that people would be willing to answer questions for the census. And the census is important for a bunch of different reasons, not just for redistricting. It also controls, the number of people that dictates the amount of federal funding we get for a variety of programs and projects. And so there have definitely been some serious concerns raised whether or not Congress will act to make sure that question isn't on the 2020 census. I don't know.
Nobody knows.
But I certainly hope they do not allow that question.
Yeah, and that would probably have an impact. I mean, I'm sure it would have an impact on Utah and our populations here, yeah. And then kind of a simple one, why does gerrymandering matter? So
gerrymandering is really important for a bunch of different reasons, right? The biggest one to me is that, a foundational value of our democracy is that the people get to choose who represents them. And gerrymandering is fundamentally opposed to that value, right? Gerrymandering is the idea that the person who represents you is actually choosing who they represent. The shorter, easier version of saying this that I use all the time is it's about letting people choose their representatives, not representatives choose their voters.
Yep.
And so that's, in my opinion, that's the biggest one. And that's true, like I said, it's not just about political party, right? It's about letting people in a given district decide who has the best judgment, who deserves to be in the legislature or in Congress to give voice to their needs and their values and their stance on any given issue. And so because gerrymandering is fundamentally opposed to that set of values, I think it's one of the most American things we can do to get rid of it.
I agree. All right, so now what does the ballot initiative do? Can you show us the...
Yeah, so this orange thing that's been on my lap this whole time is a redistricting packet. So in order to get an initiative on the ballot, you have to collect a certain number of signatures from registered voters in Utah. So the way we do that is in signature packets like these. You probably have seen us at grocery stores or liquor stores or in the park. We're all over the place.
It's a different color from the other, like...
That's true. There are a lot of ballot initiatives going around right now. Ours is orange. Just remember, we're great. Blaze orange cover. But when we collect those signatures, we try really hard to explain what the initiative does. Sometimes that can be really difficult, so I'm glad I have an opportunity to talk slightly more at length than when I've got someone trying to put their groceries in their car.
Sure.
So basically the initiative does 4 big things. The first thing it does is it creates an independent redistricting commission. That commission's composed of 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans, 2 independents, and a chairperson. So the Democratic members are chosen by the Democratic members in the state legislature. The Republican members are chosen by the Republican members of the state legislature. The chairperson is chosen by the governor. And then the 2 independent members, one is chosen by Republican leadership in the legislature, and one is chosen by Democratic leadership in the legislature. And you're probably asking yourself, I thought this commission was supposed to be independent, but you just told me the legislature and the governor picked these people. So in the initiative, there are some pretty strict rules about who can serve on the commission. Within a period of time before they're appointed, they can't have run for any political office, they can't have served in any office, they can't have served as an appointment to a commission by the governor, they can't have worked in the executive or legislative branches, so they can't have been like an employee of the legislature. They can't have been a lobbyist. There are a bunch of other prohibitions in there. Those are the biggest ones. And then for the nonpartisan members, there are a bunch of extra rules about in the 4 years before they're appointed, they have to be an active voter. So that means they have to be voting in at least every presidential election. They cannot be a registered member of any political party. They can't have been an employee of a party or have received money like as a subcontractor of a party. There are a bunch of other rules like that that we feel really confident will ensure those 2 folks will be staunchly non-Democrats and non-Republicans. And then that commission, once it draws its new maps, it has to pass out new maps by a 5-person majority. So it can't do it just along party lines. Because of the way the Utah state constitution works, we had it up so that the legislature does approve the maps that the Independent Redistricting Commission draws, but we have a couple of checks and balances in here to make sure that that happens in a way that is not going to continue to allow gerrymandering. So the other two of the other big things that this initiative does, it sets up guidelines for what redistricting is trying to achieve. So right now, every 10 years after the census, the legislature is told, draw some new boundaries, and as long as you don't break federal law, we don't care what they look like. So we set up a bunch of rules like you have to reasonably keep cities together. You have to have your districts be reasonably compact. You have to try and keep like communities together. So that would be, right, in the case of Park City, you would want to group the communities that cattle ranch and oil drill, you'd want to keep them together because their needs and their interests are most similar, sort of things like that. And then the second really important thing that the initiative would set up is a series of rules about what information you can use when drawing new districts. So right now, the legislature is allowed to use any information it wants. It can use voter registration data. It can use the party affiliation that's connected to that voter registration data. It can even go out and buy data from a third party. So in the initiative, they're still allowed to use voter registration data, which is going to include things like your name, your address, your birthday, and which elections you voted in. But they're not allowed to use the party affiliation data that's connected to that. So they have to separate that out before they start drawing maps. And then they're also not allowed to use previous candidate addresses. So you're prohibited from drawing out likely opponents in the next election. There are a couple of other rules in there that are good, but I don't want to go into really get off in the weeds. And then the fourth big thing the initiative does is if for some reason you don't think that the goals have been achieved well, or you don't think the rules were complied with fully, any person in Utah can sue and go before state courts and make their case about how they think it could have been better, which we can't currently do unless the legislature breaks federal law. So roughly the genesis of the maps in the new system is the Independent Redistricting Commission would draw new maps. They'd give them to the legislature. At that point, the legislature can say, yes, we like these maps, or no, we don't. They can't make edits to them before they decide whether they like them or not. If they say, yeah, we like these maps, we think they're great, they become the new maps for the next 10 years. If they say, no, we don't like these maps, they have to draw their own maps using the same rules and guidelines the Redistricting Commission uses. And then, once they have their maps drawn, they come back and they have to make a public defense of why their maps are better than the Redistricting Commission's maps. And then, if any one of us doesn't agree with their defense, we can sue them and force them to prove it in court. So that's broad strokes. That's what the initiative does.
Right. And right now, I live in I live in Taylorsville, so around the Salt Lake area. And right now we have 4 congressional districts, and all 4 of our districts split up Salt Lake. Right. Yeah, and so we've got we've got West Valley that is split up into 2 districts, and we've got part of the East Side that's split up into 2 districts, and it goes all the way down.
A great example of that is the city of Holiday, which has actually been cut into 3 separate congressional districts. I particularly enjoyed, the Deseret News had an editorial, this was a week or 2 ago, about they were focusing on redistricting in San Juan County because a state court had just or the federal courts had just struck down the most recent redistricting for the county commission in San Juan County. And the Deseret News editorial noted that it seemed to them to be impossible for it to be coincidence that all 4 of our U.S. congressional districts cut up one of our counties. So they took a pretty strong stance against gerrymandering, which I was pretty surprised at coming from the Deseret News. But definitely gives me a lot of hope. So.
Okay, so if the ballot initiative passes, when would it go into effect?
So the ballot initiative technically becomes law. It's about 30 days after the election. But these provisions probably wouldn't be used until the 2020 census. So there's a bit of a delay. So the 2020 census will happen, obviously, in 2020. The results of that census will get announced probably at the end of 2020 or early 2021. That's when the Independent Redistricting Commission kicks in and draws some maps. So their maps should be finished by the end of 2021, and the first election they'll take effect for is the 2022 election.
Okay. Do you think that there will be legislative challenges to this if it passes?
So one of the most important issues with all ballot initiatives in Utah is that you are not creating law that can't be changed, right? The legislature can go in and change any part of this law in the same way that they can edit the entire rest of the Utah Code. The one thing I would say is that when ballot initiatives have passed prior to this, legislators are very reluctant to go in and make changes in that section because for a ballot initiative to pass, 50% plus 1 members of the state must have voted for it, which means there's pretty strong and definitely bipartisan political support for the issue.
Yeah.
So they're going to be afraid that if they take a particular action, their voters would vote them out in their next election.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So how can people get a packet or sign it?
So to sign a packet, if you live in Salt Lake County, you can stop by our local field office, which is at 1435 South State Street, right on the corner of Cleveland Avenue and State Street. If you don't live in Salt Lake County, you can find a list of locations where you can sign on our website, which is betterboundaries.org, and those are under the volunteer tab. If you'd like to get a packet and start collecting signatures yourself, which I strongly encourage you to do, you can also find information about that on our website as well.
Cool. Chase says we have a question.
Yeah, we have another question from Gerald. He asked, minor parties in Utah, why specify Democrats and Republicans rather than writing for representatives for each party?
So I'm not 100% certain that I understand the question exactly. But so I'm gonna restate it a little bit just to make sure I understand clearly. Basically, what you're saying is why think about this process as just Republicans and Democrats when there are also other parties? So that would be parties like the Green Party, the Libertarian Party,
The new party. What's the new one?
It'll come to me. Hold on.
United Utah.
United Utah. So the initiative itself doesn't explicitly mention Republican or Democrat.
Mm-hmm.
It actually refers to the majority party in the legislature and then the largest minority party in the legislature.
Okay, so that's Republican and Democrat.
So right now, that would be Republicans are the majority, Democrats are the largest minority, and currently there's not a single member of the State House of Representatives or the State Senate that identifies with any other party or even no party.
Mm-hmm.
But let's say, hypothetically, 5 or 15 or 50 years from now, the Libertarian Party, or let's even say like a party that doesn't exist yet, right? Party X. Party X decides they're really going to go for it, and they get, 35% of the seats in the legislature. Well, if they're the largest minority party, then they get to have the role set out in the Redistricting Commission.
Mm-hmm.
The Redistricting Commission didn't specifically delegate roles to those small parties right now because those parties don't currently have any representation. I would imagine that in a scenario where, let's say, the legislature is dominated by 3 parties all at once, so there's like one party has a clear majority, so it's got 51% of the seats, the other parties have the remaining 49% divided in half. I would imagine that we would, in that scenario, go in and fix this section of the code to account for a situation like that. But it's never happened before. It hasn't happened in any state as far as I'm aware. So it wasn't a situation that we considered very likely in the immediate future.
Cool. Thanks for asking, and thanks for answering.
Yeah.
I
Great
just
question.
noticed your tie matches the ballot. Did you do that on purpose?
I did do that on
Oh,
purpose.
nice. All right. Well, there you go. So let's wrap it up. Thank you, Noah, for being with us today. Make
Thanks for having
sure, if you are watching this, make sure to follow us, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, at Better Utah. You can subscribe to our emails. The legislative session is coming up very soon. It's coming up on Monday, so make sure to subscribe to our emails. We're going to have special legislative session emails going out. Check out our website, betterutah.org, and you can check out Better Utah on the Hill. That's all about the legislative session. Better Boundaries contact info, we've given that.
Yep. Betterboundaries.org is our website. Definitely the best place to find us.
Great. And then join us next Wednesday at 12:30. We're going to be talking about Medicaid expansion in Utah. And remember to click Remind Me to get reminders when we go live. Thanks, guys.
Thanks.